Over the surface of the San Francisco Bay, night always comes a little quieter than in other cities. Here, the air smells of the ocean and kerosene, and the light from the huge hangars creates a barely noticeable flicker over the concrete strips. At 22:30 local time, a figure appears in the silence familiar to the airport, to which local employees have long been accustomed. This is a Boeing 747-400, a heavy, confident, seemingly eternally young giant for its size, which United Airlines sends on one of the longest flights in its network. His route is across the ocean, through time zones, through the night, towards Australia. Almost 15 hours of non-stop travel. A queue of passengers is slowly forming at the foot of the ramp. Someone is holding a book. Someone is holding a travel pillow. People are tired and quiet. At this late hour, no one is eager for adventures. Most just want to find their seat, buckle up, close their eyes, and let the plane take them to another world, to another continent, to another life, to another morning. 1998 was a time when there were no noisy social media feeds or constant notifications. The passenger who boarded found himself alone with himself, with his own thoughts, with his seatmates, and with a long night to spend over the ocean. Meanwhile, a completely different rhythm prevails in the cockpit. In the illumination of the instruments, in the soft hum of the systems, in the rustle of the checklist pages, everything is built around precision and the usual order. The captain, one of the most experienced people at United, sits down in a chair as if he does it automatically. Thousands of hours at the helm seem to adjust his movements themselves. His hand rests on the armrest. His gaze glides over the instruments. The phrases of the checklist sound measured, as if measuring a calm, confident pace. But behind this calmness lies an important detail. The captain did not fly much on the Boeing 747-400 itself. By the standards of aviation, it is enough. By the standards of emergency situations, it is not enough. Next to him is the first officer. Almost 10,000 hours at the helm of various machines, and 2,500 specifically on this type. His voice is steady. His hands are steady. He knows the plane, knows how it reacts to every little thing, knows how to feel it. There are two more behind the backs of these two. Two relievers, two of those who will later take over the ship in the middle of the dark, quiet water over the long Pacific Ocean. Now they are sitting in silence, watching the preparation procedure. Their eyes cling to every little thing. An experienced pilot is always watching, even when he is not directly involved. In aviation, training goes on endlessly, from everyone, always, in every detail. In the cabin, meanwhile, the flight attendants are making final preparations. Luggage racks close, bright lights go out, and soft night lights turn on. Passengers settle in, sip water, adjust pillows, and mentally go to sleep. No one knows that in just a few minutes, this plane will be so close to the edge that the distance between life and tragedy can be measured not by meters, but by breathing. The giant is slowly pushing away from the gate. The hum of the tow tractor sinks into the background. Only a slight vibration of the hull is felt. The captain gives the command to start taxiing. The plane turns around, enters the main track, rolls smoothly forward, heavy, loaded to the limit. More than 170 tons of fuel. The salon is almost overloaded. The legendary 747-400 at the maximum possible weight is always a special condition of the car. She is able to rise, she is able to go across the ocean for a huge range, but in the first minutes after separation she is especially vulnerable. Any deviation? Every second counts. The crew knows this. At these moments, the cabin becomes quieter. Conversations are only business-related. The ritual before takeoff is always the same, but it is at this moment that its special depth is felt. The steering wheel is slightly pulled down, the eyes move over the instruments, the flaps are checked, engine parameters have been checked, the configuration for takeoff has been checked. The front windows of the cockpit reflect the light of the strip, which seems to slide down them as the aircraft slowly rolls into position. From here, from the cockpit, San Francisco looks especially calm. But this silence is deceptive. It will become a contrast for everything that happens next. The plane is aligned on the axis of the runway. Now he is facing the darkness. In front of him is a smooth, long strip 28 on the right, illuminated only by lights. It seems endless. Actually, it's about 4 kilometers. It's a luxury for an empty plane. For a fully loaded 747, this is a necessity. Permission to take off sounds in the headphones. The first officer carefully applies thrust. 4 giant engines roar, the power squeezed into the metal trembling through the hull. The plane starts moving. The seconds go smoothly, confidently. The speed is increasing. 80 knots, 120, 150. Now the vibrations of the floor are felt more strongly. The wheels run quickly over the tiles. At V1, no one will be able to stop the run. Up, now the plane must fly. And after a moment, a command, familiar to every pilot, is heard. Rotate. The first officer smoothly pulls the steering wheel towards himself. The nose rises. The giant gently pulls away from the strip. Everything is going perfectly. It's just a few seconds. And then, a blow. It doesn't sound like a metallic sound or a jolt of air. This is a series of heavy, loud, rhythmic blows, as if someone is hitting the fuselage with a huge hammer. The cabin begins to vibrate so that the instruments merge. The flight attendants grab the handrails. In the cabin, people raise their heads. The sound cannot be ignored. It seems to pass through the bones themselves. The first officer immediately has a familiar thought in his head. Perhaps the wheel has collapsed. It happens, and it's dangerous, but it's not fatal. But the captain already notices something else. On the monitor of engine number 3, the temperature skyrockets, reaching 750 degrees. It's too much, too fast. It's too dangerous. It immediately removes the thrust on the problematic engine, and almost instantly the vibrations disappear. The hum becomes steady again. But along with the vibration, a quarter of the power disappears. Now the 747 is not rising as it should. A heavy plane full of fuel, 3 engines, and an almost imperceptible but ever-increasing turn to the right. The first officer pulls the steering wheel to the left, trying to compensate for the turn. He acts quickly, instinctively. When a huge plane starts to move off course, it seems natural to tilt it back. But it is precisely this action that is the most dangerous in such a situation. The ailerons rise, creating additional resistance. The plane starts to lose speed. Unnoticed, gradually, but deadly. Other things are still busy in the cabin. You need to turn off the engine completely, complete the checklist, and stabilize the system. The 2 pilots behind lean forward, preparing to perform the procedure. The first officer continues to pull the steering wheel. He does not understand that he is slowing down the plane and not helping him. Outside, it's dark at night and low clouds. San Bruno is ahead. Not a mountain, not a peak, but a rounded hill with a height of just over 400 meters. But for a heavy 3-engine 747 that is losing speed, this is a real barrier. and the crew doesn't know yet that it's flying right at him. The plane is tilting more and more to the left, but it is not possible to completely free itself from the right turn. The nose is trying to stay up, but the speed is creeping down. On the indicator, it is already falling by dozens of knots. The first officer doesn't look there. He's focused on the course, on alignment. The captain is focused on the engine. 2 replacement pilots are studying the checklist. No one sees the main thing yet. The speed is disappearing. And suddenly, 2 voices at the same time. Speed! They seem to pierce the fog of consciousness. At this point, it becomes clear to everyone. The situation is critical. The steering wheel vibration system, stick shaker, is activated almost immediately. This is the last warning signal. The plane is on the verge of crashing. In those seconds, even a multi-ton 747 feels light, fragile, like a fragile toy. It vibrates like the metal itself is shaking. The captain takes over the controls. He lowers the nose of the plane. It's almost unnatural. When a mountain is in front of you and GPWS shouts pull up, the pilot has to go up. But if he pulls, the plane will crash. And then nothing will save him. Neither the remaining engines, nor the experience, nor the prayers. The plane is flying low. Too low. Residents of the districts on the slope of San Bruno hear this roar so close that the glass doors of the houses shake. People are running out into the street, calling the airport, asking if the plane is crashing. On the dispatcher's radar, the UA-863 point deviates from the course and disappears into the shadow of the terrain. There is silence in the cabin, broken only by the voices of the alarm systems. GPWS repeats the signal. The radio altimeter tends downward, 500 feet, 300, 200, 100, and suddenly the speed increases. Gradually, 1 note at a time, 2 at a time, the nose remains slightly lowered. The captain literally holds the plane on the thinnest line between lift and failure. The plane passes over the top of San Bruno with a gap of about 30 meters. 30 meters for an airplane with a wingspan of almost 65 meters is less than half of its own size. This is the distance that feels like breathing in the cabin, like the wind that can change fate. But it passes. And now, for the first time in all these long, incredibly intense minutes, there is a chance. A space appears. The sky appears, not the earth ahead. The captain levels the plane. The speed is increasing, and that calm, measured voice is heard in the cockpit again. We are declaring an emergency. Then there will be a return. Then there will be a fuel dump. Then there will be a heavy landing in the fog. Then there are pages of reports, investigations, and dozens of unanswered questions. But now the main thing is that they are alive. They flew by. The seconds that separated them from death were left behind. And ahead is a story that will be analyzed for decades as an example of how thin the line is between experience and fatigue, between skill and forgetting, between routine and disaster, which can happen when the world suddenly shifts just a few degrees. When the speed stabilized and the plane stopped feeling fragile for the first time, as if suspended by an invisible thread, the captain allowed himself a short, almost imperceptible breath. He did not change his expression, did not let go of the steering wheel, did not look at the co-pilot, but inside it was clear that the worst was over. It's not safe, not calmly, but behind it. The crew declares an emergency. The hum of the radio is getting louder, a little denser. The dispatcher, who just a few minutes ago lost point 863 from the radar, is now responding especially carefully. There is tension in his voice, but also relief. The plane is still here, it is flying, and although its trajectory is strange and dangerous, the crew is alive. And above San Bruno, People are still standing in the dark streets, looking back at the sky, trying to figure out what happened. Some people still hear vibrations in their ears, as if the sound came from inside the houses. One of the eyewitnesses would later say that the plane flew so low that he felt a hot stream of air. Perhaps an exaggeration, but not too far from the truth. The airliner had a few seconds, and they almost disappeared. Now it's space, air, the opportunity to get on course and go to the ocean. The dispatcher gives instructions. Gain an altitude of 5,000 feet and go over the water. The crew agrees without hesitation. They know they're overloaded. They know that landing is impossible with the current weight. The landing gear will not hold up, the braking systems will go beyond the load, and the structure may suffer irreversible damage. And most importantly, the plane, touching the runway with such a heavy mass, may lose control at the end of the distance. This is a risk that is unacceptable now, when 307 people rely on them. But getting to the ocean is also a challenge. Despite the fact that the speed is now steadily increasing, Boeing is still heavy, clumsy, and after such a sharp, nervous episode, the crew looks at every parameter as a possible source of a new threat. The captain gives the order to retract the flaps to the next configuration, then raise the nose to a more calm set. The plane slowly, as if reluctantly, stretches upward. Outside the windows, the same night fog is still there, gray and dense like a blanket covering the city. Somewhere out there, below them, there is still a vibration in the hearts of those who saw the flight. But there's no vibration here in the cabin, and that's progress. Next to the captain, the first officer sits almost motionless. His hands are slightly tense. He knows he's made mistakes. But at such moments in aviation, there is no time for analysis. Not now. He continues to perform his duties, monitors the altitude, reports parameters, executes commands. Only later, when everything is over, when there will be a report, when there will be simulations, professional analysis, then it will be possible to return to these seconds. Right now, it's just work. When the plane finally reaches 5,000 feet, the space around it seems to open up. The city remains behind. Now it's just the ocean. Just a dark expanse, so calm that it seems silent. There is a void under the wings of several hundred tons of metal, and only the instruments say that they are moving over the water and not standing still. The crew turns on the fuel discharge system. Outwardly, it is almost imperceptible. Only a slight noise, a slight change in vibration. But the effect is huge. Hundreds of kilograms are dropped in a minute, dozens of tons per hour. To return the aircraft to the weight allowed for landing, it is necessary to reduce the weight by almost 70 tons. The plane was refueled for a flight of 12,000 kilometers. They had only flown a few miles. The captain gives the command to keep a circle, move in large loops over the ocean. Radio communication is calm. The dispatcher watches on the radar as the UA-863 describes wide arcs. In the cabin, the flight attendants move quietly and cautiously. They check on passengers and reassure those who are worried, although most do not yet know the true extent of what happened. People felt vibrations, jerky thuds, and heard disturbing sounds. But no one saw the approaching darkness of the mountain. No one saw the radio altimeter running to zero. They think it's just a technical glitch. Things happen. Unpleasant, but not fatal. In one of the rows, a woman adjusts a blanket on a child. He sleeps as if nothing had happened. Behind the curtains in the kitchen, the crew of flight attendants confer in whispers. What should I tell people? When? So far, there is little information. They were only told that there was a technical failure and the plane is returning. They don't know how close it was either. It takes 10 minutes, then 20, then 30. On each turn over the ocean, the turbulence is light, almost gentle, but everything is tense in the cabin. The weather over the city is getting worse. The fog is thickening. It becomes clear that if they dump fuel for the same amount, the clouds may fall below the minimum allowed for landing. If the airport goes to zero, you will have to go to an alternate airfield. But with one engine failing and the crew suffering stress, this is an additional risk. The captain looks at the instruments, then at the first officer. "We can sit down with this weight. The plane will survive." FO nods. There are doubts inside, but he trusts the captain. Trust is the basis of the crew. The two replacement pilots look at each other quietly. They also understand the dilemma. Too much fuel is dangerous, too little. They will have to fly to Los Angeles or Auckland. And an ultra-long-range flight with one engine in a faulty state is an undesirable option. Decisions are made quickly. In aviation, sometimes you don't have to choose the ideal solution, but the least risky one. They are requesting permission to return. The dispatcher confirms that lane 28 on the right is free. Visibility is limited but acceptable, and the plane turns towards the shore. Now, another stage. Much more calm, but still responsible. Landing an overloaded aircraft is a difficult job. The crew begins pre-entry procedures. They check the settings. They check the flaps. They check the speed. Each element must be accurate. At this moment, the cabin is filled again with that smooth, working rhythm that only happens in a professional team. No one talks about their experiences. No one remembers San Bruno. All this will remain later. It's boarding now. When the coastline re-enters the black silhouette outside the windows, passengers notice that the plane is no longer circling. A whisper appears in the cabin. Someone is asking the flight attendant questions. She answers softly, confidently. "We're going back to boarding." Just that. No worries, no unnecessary words. Approaching the runway in fog conditions is a simple procedure for a modern aircraft, but requires care. The command voice of the auto landing system can be heard in the cockpit. But they fly manually. The captain starts flying the plane himself, despite his fatigue, despite the stress he has suffered. The instinct of an experienced pilot is to take the helm when the situation goes beyond the usual. The speed is decreasing. The flaps are released gradually. Huge surfaces, like the wings of a bird, open themselves outwards. The chassis comes out with a characteristic rumble. Vibration passes through the body. Passengers feel it, as always. But this time, the flight attendants inside are also startled. Every sound seems too loud. At the far end of the strip, the lights are almost lost in the fog. The plane passes the glide path confidently, but hard. He doesn't float like a light car. He seems to be floating, moving forward by inertia, huge, powerful, but tired. The captain holds the helm gently, controls every movement. Short reports are heard in the cockpit. The speed is stable. The height is normal. The glide path has been checked. And finally, the last meters. The land they were so afraid to see a few minutes ago is now becoming a target. The touch is a little tougher than usual, but confident. The hum of the reverse. Long run. Braking is smooth and even, although the plane is still heavy. No jerks, no panic. Only the confident work of a huge machine that had survived everything it could survive that night. When the plane finally slows down to taxiing speed, There is that special silence in the cabin. It lasts for a few seconds. Therefore, silence can measure the value of human experience. Everyone is alive. The plane is on the ground. The danger is over. Only then does the captain take his hand off the steering wheel and, for the first time, allow himself to exhale as if this air had been accumulating inside him for the last 20 minutes. The passengers don't see it. They think there's been a technical failure. They go out to the terminal with unhappy sighs. Someone is worried about the transfer. Someone is calling home. Someone is scolding the airline for the delay. They only find out the truth from the newspapers. Only from the evening news. Only from analytical programs, which will then parse the text of the report. And the report will tell you the main thing. This flight was a few seconds away from the tragedy. A few seconds and a few knots of air between the wing and the dark ground. While the crew is processing the documents and communicating with the technical service, the first assumptions are already beginning to sound in the background noise of the airport. How did it happen? Why did takeoff, a routine procedure, turn out to be almost disastrous for this flight? Why did the experienced crew make mistakes? And how exactly did it happen that the plane ended up right on the trajectory of the hill? The answers will come later. And they won't just be about pilots. But now, in the warm light of the terminal, when the night is already turning to dawn, the UA-863 team knows one thing. They saved 307 people. And they did it on the verge of human possibilities. On the verge of speed. On the verge of heights. On the verge of life and its absence. When the cabin finally sank into relative calm, and the plane was parked with the engines turned off, there came that strange moment of aftertaste that only happens after extreme events. Just a few minutes ago, the metal of the case was shaking with tension. The instruments were flashing, and the air was vibrating with warnings. And now there is only the quiet hum of ventilation, the occasional footsteps of mechanics overboard, and the restrained breathing of people who have not yet fully realized what exactly happened. The captain took off his headphones and carefully placed them on the dashboard, as if placing an object of unknown importance on the table. The first officer leaned back in his chair and allowed himself to relax his shoulders for the first time. But there was no relief in this relaxation, only exhaustion. He knew that there were mistakes in his actions. He knew that if it hadn't been for the captain's intervention in the last seconds, the plane might not have flown over San Bruno. But it will need to be analyzed later. The main thing now is the procedure. Behind the cabin door, the lives of 288 passengers resume their usual rhythm. People pack up, check their phones, which, after being turned off for the entire flight, can finally serve as a channel of communication with the world again. Some are asking what will happen next. When will the flight to Sydney be rescheduled? Others tell each other what they felt during takeoff. Some did not even notice the danger. They were knocked out of their usual rut. But they do not know that the fate of these minutes depended on the difference in dozens of knots of speed. The flight attendants slowly lead the passengers out of the plane. Their faces still retain the expression that comes after stressful events. Concentration, inner trembling, but maximum professionalism on the surface. Smiles, soft phrases, calm explanations. What happened affects only in small things. A slightly heavier breath, a slightly closer observation of the passengers, quiet glances at each other. a group of mechanics is already standing on the platform, near the front landing gear. They arrived quickly, but carefully, as if restraining an impulse. Their task is to assess the damage to engine No. 3, which overheated and caused the very vibration that started it all. But the damage to the engine is only a mechanical part. The human room is much more voluminous. While the mechanics are examining the hull, the captain and the first officer go to the briefing room, the one where the pilots meet before the flight to discuss the route, weather, and flight features. Now they are returning there to answer questions from airline representatives and flight safety staff. Everything is going on calmly, correctly, but inside everyone there is an understanding. Today's episode will be a topic for a long investigation. First, the captain is asked to describe his actions in detail. His voice is smooth, without emotional swings. He speaks the same way he would when describing a learning situation. But there is tension in every pause. He admits that at the time of the engine failure, he focused on the technical part and temporarily left the first officer alone with the controls. He knows that this is not the best scenario. Ideally, one pilot should monitor the flight, and the other should fix the problem. But in reality, the human brain chooses a focus under stress. He chose to find out what happened to the engine. And I almost missed the speed reduction. When the turn comes to the first officer, the atmosphere in the room changes. He speaks honestly. It's obvious right away. He admits that he took actions that contradict training. He used ailerons instead of a rudder, instinctively pulled the steering wheel to keep climbing instead of controlling speed. It could have been a fatal mistake. But it's not just because of his decisions that night. When his recent flight hours were checked, everything became clear. Over the previous 12 months, he had performed only one takeoff and one landing. One for the year. The numbers amazed everyone. That's why the moment instinct, rather than a formed skill, took effect. He chose the wrong action. Rare practice makes any skill fragile, even for an experienced professional. While the first interviews are underway, passengers are already arriving at the terminal building on buses. They check in for a replacement flight that the airline has arranged for the next day. Some people looking at the local newspapers in the morning will be surprised. There was no fire on the runway, the plane was not damaged, everyone is alive, but the headlines will be loud. UA 863 narrowly avoided a collision with a hill. Residents reported a low flight. The investigation is investigating the causes of the dangerous decline. Some passengers will return home without paying attention to what happened. Others will tell friends that the plane was shaking or there was a strange feeling. Only a few people will realize how thin was the line on which the giant Boeing was balancing. Meanwhile, the airline is launching its own investigation, out of schedule, without delay. They know that the NTSB and FAA will get involved later, but the internal work is needed now. They invite the captain and the first officer to the simulator, the one where the pilots work out the engine failure. But now the task is different: to reconstruct exactly what happened, down to the smallest detail. Speed, tilt angle, engine parameters, flap position. When the simulation starts, it becomes scary even for those who know that they are sitting in a completely safe cabin. The figures speak for themselves. If the speed reduction had continued for a few more seconds, if the captain had intervened a little later, if the FO had not heard the cry for speed, the plane would not have been able to fly over San Bruno. And then the consequences would be irreversible. This experiment comes as a shock to the airline. They're showing a simulation recording to all 9,500 United pilots. This is becoming one of the largest training events in the company's history. The point is to remind you of something that many have forgotten. In an engine failure on takeoff, the main thing is speed. Always. Any other action is secondary, even the climb. But this is only part of the conclusions. The second, even more unpleasant, concerns the regularity of flights. Previously, it was thought that experience was a clock in the cockpit. But this incident shows that even if an experienced pilot has not practiced takeoffs and landings for several months, his manual control skills can noticeably decrease. So much so that automatism disappears, and in its place comes instinct, which is often erroneous. Flying an airplane is not a bicycle. The ability to act quickly, accurately, and correctly requires constant training. United introduces new rules. Each pilot must perform at least 3 takeoffs and 3 landings every 90 days. This rule will become the industry standard. But there was another problem, a deep, systemic one. In the era of active automation, airplanes are increasingly performing most of the flight themselves. Autopilot, auto-traction, automatic approach modes. The pilots are sitting in their seats, monitoring the parameters, and executing checklists. It sounds reliable, but there is a downside. Many people's manual piloting skills are gradually becoming blunted. UA863 is just one example. Then there will be others. This includes Indonesia AirAsia Flight 8501, where the degradation of manual control skills became the tragic cause of one of the most famous cases of our time. The investigation of UA863 will be an important step in understanding the problem. The report explicitly states that the industry needs to rethink the balance of automation and manual control. But while the reports are being written, passengers are going to their hotels, someone is calling home, someone is swearing because of thwarted plans. People rarely see those barely noticeable but fateful lines that run through their lives. The night, which ended with a flight delay for them, became one of the most stressful in their careers for the crew. The captain sits in the briefing room for a long time after all the interviews. The light bulbs dimly illuminate the table, where quiet, routine preparatory meetings usually take place. Now everything is different. He knows that he saved the plane, but he also knows that his own mistake could have led to the worst. He is aware of the delicate balance between professionalism and the human factor. The first officer is sitting nearby. He's silent. He examines his own hands, the ones that pulled the steering wheel up when it needed to be lowered. The hands that tried to compensate for the turn with the ailerons when it was necessary to turn on the rudder. He thinks that in the textbook, these actions were simple, understandable, logical. But the real situation, with the noise, vibrations, blinding noises, turned knowledge into instincts. And my instincts failed me. He wasn't a bad pilot. He was experienced. I just haven't practiced active management for too long. United does not punish him. The company understands. This is not a personal fault. This is a systemic problem, and it needs to be solved systematically. And outside the windows, the dawn is slowly rising over the bay, dim, cold, but calm. The plane, which narrowly escaped tragedy a few hours ago, is parked under the tower. There are no traces of that night on its surface, no scratches, no cracks. He looks absolutely ordinary. But there is a chapter in his story that will be discussed for decades. The chapter is about how a few seconds and a few knots of speed can determine the fate of hundreds of people. The chapter is about how experience and automation can come into conflict when something sudden happens. The chapter is about the fact that in aviation, the perfect balance between iron and man is a fragile thing, like the night before a flight. The UA-863 will return to service. Other planes will fly to Sydney later on the same route. Today it's a Boeing 757 or 787. New, technological, much more automated. But the memory of that night will remain. And not because it was an almost tragic flight. This is because he changed the approach to pilot training, forced us to reconsider the philosophy of training, and reminded us that real skills are formed not only by time, but also by practice, and that even the most experienced pilot can face a situation in which instinct turns out to be the enemy. The UA-863 has become a reminder to the whole world. There is a person behind every flight, and sometimes it's the person who saves hundreds of others, even when the car itself is close to the limit. A few days after the incident, a group of specialists gathered at the United Technical Base Center. These were not only engineers and instructors, but also human factors experts, representatives of the Flight Safety Department, and flight training psychologists and analysts. The Flight 863 incident did not look like a classic engine failure. It has become a much more alarming signal. He showed that the problem lies deeper. It is not related to technology, but to people, to the structure of education, and to the very philosophy of modern aviation. This realization came quickly and was almost unpleasant because of its obviousness. Airplanes had become too reliable. Paradoxically, this played a role in the fact that pilots were less likely to be able to train in conditions of unexpected failure. Airplanes have been improved for decades. Redundancy systems, automation, engine condition monitoring, load balancing algorithms, improved materials. Breakdowns became more and more rare, but at the same time, there were fewer and fewer situations when the pilot faced a real challenge. And when that challenge did come, it required an instant reaction, the kind that only regular exercise generates. Knowing the schema is one thing. Muscle memory is something else entirely. It is she who keeps the plane in the air when there is a roar in the cabin. The instruments tremble, the altitude disappears into oblivion, and decisions need to be made faster than a thought can flash by. And in this incident, the skills failed. Therefore, when United recreated the flight in a simulator, in a dark room surrounded by walls with monitors, every second of the recording became a cold confirmation. Any pilot could find himself in such a situation, and anyone who lost practice could make the same mistakes. Not from incompetence, but from the fact that the skill is dulled without use. At the meeting, the instructor shows a recording. The green line of the UA-863 course wraps around the edge of San Bruno. There is a sharp drop in the height graph and a rapid decrease in the speed graph. He switches the picture to the radio altimeter data. 100 feet, 80, 60, 40. The peak of the most dangerous point. There is silence in the room. Not the intense silence that happens in the cockpit, but deep, calm, the one that comes when people realize the scale of what happened. 2 more knots, says the instructor. 2 more knots lower, and the wing would have lost lift. 2 nodes is nothing. This is an error in breathing. An inner sigh, tilt of the head, for a moment. But it was that moment that determined whether the plane would land back on the ground or disappear into the black night with hundreds of people on board. The instructors then write a report. It's not accusatory. It's analytical. He explains, "The pilots knew the theory well. They had excellent command of automated modes. They understood the checklists, knew the engine parameters. But when the system malfunctioned, when noise and vibration put the brain in fight or flight mode, when the body acted faster than the mind, exactly those habits that are formed by regular practice came to the surface. And if there is little practice, the habit is looking for the simplest way. The instinct is up, although you need to go down. The instinct is to correct the roll, although it is necessary to compensate for the yaw. The instinct to pull is when you need to let go. United decides to act radically. The week after the incident, each pilot of the company receives an invitation to a mandatory session in the simulator, where they are shown a reconstruction. Many pilots admit that the footage gives them goosebumps. On the screen, the plane is flying over San Bruno so low that it seems as if the trajectory is touching the ground. They see what the crew saw only through the instruments, the real picture of the risk. After watching, the instructors ask the pilots to perform an exercise, engine failure on takeoff. An old, familiar, almost routine task. But it is performed manually, without auto traction, without autopilot. And many of them, despite decades in the sky, understand that the skill of jet manual control has become less acute. It didn't disappear, but it dulled. This is the key conclusion for both the FAA and other airlines. Meanwhile, in Australia, a new story is appearing in the offices of aviation correspondents. Journalists compare UA863 with other cases of engine failures during takeoff. Almost all of them end with a safe climb, U-turn, and landing. But one factor distinguishes the UA863 from the majority: the proximity of San Bruno. Geography played a role. In most airports, the departure vector after an engine failure takes the aircraft over the plain or over the water. In San Francisco, the mountainous terrain is located directly along the trajectory of standard care. But even that doesn't explain everything. The most important thing is the human factor. When the NTSB publishes the first findings in a few weeks, it will be clearly written there. The lack of experiment in real situations leads to a deterioration in skills. Automation does not replace manual craftsmanship. It only complements it. And in critical moments, it is the basic, fundamental skills that become crucial. The report will contain a phrase that will be analyzed many times later. The crew acted in good faith, but given the lack of current manual piloting practice, the response to the failure was not optimal. This is a statement without accusations, but with a clear message. The system needs to be changed. United will introduce a mandatory number of takeoffs and landings per quarter. It will update the training procedures. It will include additional exercises on auto traction failure, speed control, and U-turn operations under reduced traction conditions. Other airlines will also start reviewing their programs. This is not a quick process. The aviation industry does not like sudden changes. But the precedent turned out to be strong. Meanwhile, Flight UA863 is turning into an example given to students of aviation academies. It is disassembled at the CRM, Crew Resource Management courses. It is used in training programs on the human factor. But the main thing is that they remember him to explain. In modern aviation, the responsibility is not only to react correctly, it's about always being prepared for stress, to prevent the skill from disappearing into the autopilot clock. Time passes. Other cars have been flying on the Sydney, San Francisco flight for a long time. Modern, easy to manage. It depends less on the person and more on the software systems. But there is still one simple truth behind all this. A technique can work perfectly 1,000 times in a row and then require a person to do something that cannot be called a procedure once. Only inner mastery. There is a long-standing phrase among United pilots. Flight 863 reminded us that autopilot is a luxury and manual control is a responsibility. It is spoken by one of the instructors who has gone through hundreds of training sessions and dozens of investigations. This is a lesson for young people. For veterans, this is a confirmation of what they always knew. There is no secondary role in the cockpit. Even when it seems like you're doing everything right, it's important to remember that machine calm can disappear in a second. As for the passengers, most of them return to normal life after a week. Someone has a business trip, someone has a vacation, someone transfers to a new flight to Sydney and sits in a chair that evening, not thinking about the fact that a few days ago he was part of one of the most dangerous situations in the history of the route. But the crew remembers, especially the captain. He reviews the report again, reads the analytical conclusions, remembers the second when the radio altimeter showed less than 100, and GPWS screamed about the danger. He knows that the decision to pull or let go of his nose at that moment was not just a technique, it was an internal struggle with instinct. And the fact that he kept the plane on the edge is his personal victory, but also his personal responsibility. The first officer also thinks for a long time, but his path is different. He returns to the training program, undergoes additional training, flies more often, consciously chooses more flights where he performs takeoffs and landings. A year later, he becomes stronger as a pilot than he was before UA-863. And this is also part of the story of how mistakes can be made better if a person is willing to look at them honestly. After a while, UA-863 will stop being discussed in the news. It will remain a line in reports and textbooks, but its real consequences will live on in the cockpits, where pilots are now more likely to take control manually in order not to lose shape. In simulators, where they work out the loss of an engine not as a formality, but as a real scenario. In briefings, where they reflect not only on the weather and the course, but also on the human factor. And on those calm, almost weekday nights, when a huge airliner rises above the city and disappears into the clouds, pilots know that every takeoff is always a point where experience meets unpredictability. And no matter what happens next, the main thing is to remember the lessons of those who have come a millimeter closer to danger than anyone would like. UA-863 was not a tragedy. It became a warning. And this is one of the most valuable forms of safety that aviation can provide. The opportunity to learn from what ended well, so that you never have to learn from what ended differently.